On the cool autumn morning of October 14, 2014, Kevin Marshall left his small apartment in Eugene, Oregon. In the trunk of his sedan were a camping pack, a tent, and just enough food for 3 days. For Kevin, this was nothing unusual. At 34 years old, he often escaped into the wilderness of the Cascade Mountains. Long hikes, nights under the stars, and the quiet peace of nature were the places he felt most at home. But that weekend would be different. It would be the last time anyone ever saw him alive. Days later, when he failed to return, concern turned to alarm. His car was still parked at the trailhead. His belongings were untouched. His phone was silent. It was as if Kevin had simply vanished into the dense Oregon forest. Rescue teams combed the trails for weeks. Search dogs, helicopters, and volunteers scoured the terrain, from steep ridges to shadowed valleys. Yet there was nothing, no footprints, no clothing, no trace at all. Kevin seemed to have dissolved into thin air. Almost 1 year later, when hope had nearly faded, a horrifying discovery was made. In an abandoned sawmill on the edge of Willamette National Forest, inside a rusted wood shredder, investigators found fragments of clothing, bone, and a torn backpack. Forensic testing confirmed the worst. It was Kevin Marshall. How did a quiet weekend hike lead to such a gruesome fate? And in those missing months, what really happened to Kevin before his body ended up inside a sawmill shredder? Kevin Marshall was not the kind of man most people expected to make headlines. At 34, he lived a modest life in Eugene, Oregon, working quietly as a software developer for a small local firm. To his colleagues, Kevin was dependable, diligent, and perhaps a little reserved. He was the type of person who preferred hiking boots to polished shoes, who would rather spend a Saturday among towering pines than in a crowded bar. Friends often described him as thoughtful and introspective, a man who carried the weight of recent years quietly. He had gone through a difficult divorce not long before his disappearance, a chapter that left him searching for a sense of balance. Nature became his refuge. The solitude of the forest, the rhythm of long hikes, and the discipline of photography gave him comfort. His camera, often slung over his shoulder, captured not just landscapes, but the silence and mystery of Oregon's wilderness. Kevin was no stranger to adventure. He had hiked dozens of trails across the Pacific Northwest and was careful about preparation. He kept his gear well organized: a sturdy green tent, a compact sleeping bag, trail maps folded neatly in waterproof sleeves, and enough supplies to last several days. Family members often said that he wasn't reckless. He was experienced, someone who respected the dangers of the wild. On October 14, 2014, Kevin planned what seemed like a simple 3-day escape into the Cascade Mountains. His destination was the Willamette National Forest, a vast and rugged stretch of wilderness known for its dense woods and abandoned remnants of the timber industry. Among his stops, Kevin had mentioned one particular place that intrigued him: the remains of an old sawmill, left to rust in silence at the edge of the forest. He told his sister Melanie that he wanted to photograph it, to capture the strange beauty of a place once alive with industry but now reclaimed by moss and shadow. That Friday, Kevin made his last call. He spoke to Melanie, his voice calm, even optimistic. He shared his weekend plans, assuring her he would return by Sunday evening. There was no sign of fear, no hint that anything was unusual. For Kevin, it was another chance to lose himself in the quiet solitude he cherished, another opportunity to gather photographs and perhaps find a measure of peace. Yet the journey he set out on would not end as planned. By the time Melanie realized she hadn't heard from him again, the days had already begun to stretch into silence. What was supposed to be a simple escape into nature became the beginning of a mystery that would haunt his family and the forests of Oregon for years to come. Kevin Marshall was expected back in Eugene by Sunday evening. By then, his sister Melanie thought she would receive a call, maybe even a few photographs from his camera, images of forests painted in autumn color, and perhaps the abandoned sawmill he had mentioned. But Sunday passed in silence. By Monday morning, the silence stretched into unease. When Tuesday arrived with no word from Kevin, concern turned into fear. His green sedan was found exactly where he had left it, neatly parked at the trailhead on the edge of the Cascade Wilderness. Inside the trunk lay a small collection of supplies he hadn't taken with him: extra food, a few changes of clothes, and his camp stove. It was clear Kevin had intended only a short trip, traveling light, with just the essentials in his pack. But his return should have been simple. The trails he planned to follow weren't considered especially dangerous. Remote, yes, but well-trodden by hikers and hunters alike. Searchers began retracing his possible routes. The forest, however, seemed to swallow every trace of him. Dogs picked up no useful scent. Helicopters scanning from above found no signs of a campfire, no flash of color from his tent or sleeping bag. Even the carefully folded maps he always carried offered no clue. They had vanished with him. Witnesses offered little to work with. A couple hiking near the ridge that weekend thought they saw a man walking alone, wearing a dark jacket and carrying a camera. But they weren't certain it was Kevin. Another local claimed to have glimpsed a figure near the derelict sawmill, a shadow moving between the collapsed beams and rusted machinery. Investigators couldn't confirm either account, but both fueled growing unease. Days of coordinated searching became weeks. Teams swept through gorges and creeks, probing thickets so dense that sunlight barely reached the forest floor. Nothing turned up. No footprints. No scraps of clothing. Not even discarded wrappers that might suggest where he had eaten. It was as if Kevin had stepped off the trail and dissolved into the trees. For his family, the absence was unbearable. Melanie and their parents traveled to Oregon, joining the volunteers who combed the woods day after day. They plastered flyers around nearby towns, pleading for information. At night, when the searchers gathered by campfires, conversations turned to speculation. Some whispered that Kevin had suffered a fall into one of the deep ravines, his body hidden where no one could reach. Others feared something darker, that he had crossed paths with someone who didn't want him found. The weeks slipped by without progress. The official search scaled down, leaving only scattered efforts by loved ones who refused to give up. Autumn gave way to the damp chill of winter. Snow covered the ridges, making the trails nearly impassable. By spring, Kevin's name had faded from the headlines. The case lingered as one more unsolved disappearance in the vast and unforgiving wilderness of Oregon. Yet the mystery was far from over. For somewhere in that forest, or perhaps beyond it, Kevin Marshall's story was still waiting to be uncovered. When the official rescue efforts ended, the Marshall family refused to let Kevin's trail go cold. To them, he was not just another name added to the long list of people who had vanished in Oregon's wilderness. He was a son, a brother, a man whose absence left a raw emptiness at every family gathering. And so, they pressed forward, funding private searches, hiring experts, and walking the same trails again and again, desperate for even the smallest clue. In the months that followed, the search expanded beyond the original radius. Independent trackers studied the terrain, looking for disturbances in the soil or marks along the trees that might have suggested Kevin had passed through. Hunters moving through the forest were asked to stay alert for any signs: shreds of fabric, discarded gear, a misplaced boot, but nothing surfaced. Each expedition ended with the same conclusion: there was simply no trace of him. Rumors began to circulate in nearby towns. Some locals claimed the forest had a history of swallowing people whole, of hikers stepping into the shadows and never emerging. Others spoke in hushed tones about the sawmill ruins. They said it wasn't the first time strange things had happened there. Sounds of machinery at night, flickers of light when no one was supposed to be inside. For Kevin's family, these stories only deepened their torment. Was his disappearance an accident, or was there something far more sinister lurking behind the silence? Melanie, who had spoken to her brother the night before he vanished, struggled most with the unanswered questions. She replayed that last conversation endlessly, listening for hidden meaning in his words, for some sign that he had sensed danger or unease. But Kevin's voice on the phone had been steady, calm, even cheerful. There was nothing to suggest fear. The void that followed made the silence more unbearable. By winter, the landscape itself had become a barrier. Snow sealed off access to many trails, turning rivers into icy barriers, and ridges into walls of white. The Marshall family had no choice but to wait, clinging to fading hope that spring would bring new discoveries. But when the snow melted, the forest revealed nothing. No equipment, no bones, no answers. The authorities, faced with dozens of similar unsolved cases across the Pacific Northwest, quietly shifted resources to other priorities. To them, Kevin was a tragic but familiar story, one more hiker swallowed by unforgiving terrain. But to his loved ones, he was still out there somewhere, in need of closure. As the months slipped into a full year, Kevin's disappearance transformed from a news story into a ghost tale whispered around the edges of campfires. Strangers speculated, theories multiplied, but the family received no solid leads. Every time the phone rang, Melanie's heart raced, only to sink again when it was never the call she hoped for. And then, in October of the following year, when most had resigned themselves to never knowing, a discovery broke the silence. In a forgotten corner of the forest, inside the rusted shell of a sawmill long abandoned, a worker stumbled across something horrific, something that would shatter whatever fragile peace the Marshall family had managed to build. The truth had not disappeared. It had been waiting, hidden in steel and rust, all along. It was almost exactly 1 year to the day after Kevin disappeared when the silence finally cracked. On a damp October morning, a maintenance worker was sent to inspect the shell of an abandoned sawmill that had stood for decades at the edge of Willamette National Forest. The building was nothing more than rotting timber and rusted machinery, its skeletal frame creaking against the wind. Most avoided the site, dismissing it as dangerous, or worse, haunted by the ghosts of Oregon's timber past. Inside, the worker moved cautiously through shadows and dripping beams, the floor littered with scraps of metal and fragments of wood. His flashlight swept across old conveyor belts, rust-stained saw blades, and finally, the hulking shape of a wood shredder that hadn't been touched in years. At first glance, it seemed just another relic of the mill's long-abandoned operations. But then, something caught his eye. Wedged among the jagged teeth of the machine was fabric weathered, torn, but unmistakably a piece of clothing. He leaned closer. What he saw next froze him in place. Fragments of bone, pale against the dark steel, tangled with scraps of cloth, and the remains of a backpack strap. The smell was faint but unforgettable, the lingering trace of decay even after months had passed. Authorities were called immediately. The site was sealed off, and investigators moved in with grim precision. Forensic teams spent hours dismantling parts of the machine, carefully retrieving what remained. Slowly, a horrifying picture emerged. Among the rust and debris, they recovered partial skeletal remains, shreds of outdoor gear, and the remnants of a camera lens. The serial number on the backpack matched one Kevin's family had described. When DNA testing was completed, the confirmation arrived beyond any doubt. The remains belonged to Kevin Marshall. The man who had vanished without a trace in the Cascade Mountains had been here all along, hidden inside the steel jaws of a forgotten shredder. News of the discovery spread quickly, shocking not only Kevin's loved ones, but also the entire community. The thought of a missing hiker was tragic enough, but the reality that his final moments ended within a piece of machinery once used to devour logs was almost too horrifying to grasp. How had he ended up there? Had he stumbled upon the mill by accident, seeking shelter from the weather, only to fall victim to a rusting machine? Or had someone placed him there deliberately, using the sawmill as a grotesque hiding place? The answers were unclear. The remains reveal little about what had truly happened in Kevin's final hours. All that was certain was this: the silence had ended, but what replaced it was far more terrifying than anyone had imagined. The discovery of Kevin Marshall's remains inside the sawmill shredder left investigators and the public with far more questions than answers. How could a seasoned hiker with years of experience in the wilderness end up in such a gruesome place? Was it an accident, a tragic misstep inside the decaying structure? Or was it something darker, something intentionally hidden in plain sight? Early theories leaned toward accident. Perhaps Kevin, drawn to the sawmill for photographs, had slipped into the machine. But those who visited the site after the discovery dismissed this possibility. The shredder was massive, elevated off the ground, and long inoperable. Climbing into it would not have been easy. It wasn't a place one simply fell into. The second possibility was foul play. Could Kevin have encountered someone in the forest, an opportunist, or a predator who used the sawmill as a dumping ground? The sheer remoteness of the location made it convenient for anyone hoping to conceal evidence, yet no signs of bother. Struggle were found nearby. No tools or weapons left behind. If this was a murder, it was meticulously executed. Then came the most chilling speculation. The sawmill was not simply an accident site or an improvised hiding spot. Instead, some believed it had ties to illicit operations. Abandoned mills across Oregon had long been rumored to serve as meeting points for illegal activity poachers, smugglers, even drug traffickers using the forests as cover. What if Kevin had stumbled upon something he wasn't meant to see? Those close to Kevin knew his curiosity. He wasn't reckless, but he was drawn to places others avoided. The mill had fascinated him enough to mention it to his sister before he left. What if, while exploring, he encountered individuals using the mill for purposes far from innocent? A quiet hiker with a camera would have been a problem. His presence alone could have threatened to expose something hidden in those woods. Investigators never confirmed this theory, but locals whispered about it. Some claimed they had seen strange activity near the mill trucks late at night, lights flickering inside the ruins when no workers were supposed to be there. If Kevin had wandered into such a scene, the consequences might have been swift and brutal. Placing his body in the shredder would have been both symbolic and practical, destroying evidence in a place already drenched in rust and decay. For Melanie and the rest of Kevin's family, the idea was unbearable. It suggested not only that his death was deliberate, but also that others had chosen silence over justice. A year had passed before his remains were found, ample time for anyone involved to vanish, leaving no trail behind. The fourth theory, linking Kevin's death to shadowy dealings at the mill, remains the most haunting. It implies that his fate was not random misfortune, but the result of crossing paths with secrets buried deep in Oregon's timberlands. And yet, no arrests were ever made. No further evidence surfaced. The forest kept its silence, and the old sawmill stood as a monument to unanswered questions. For Kevin Marshall's family, the confirmation of his fate was not the end of their torment. It was the beginning of another kind of suffering. When detectives informed them that his remains had been discovered in the rusting machinery of an abandoned sawmill, there was no sense of closure. Instead, the news ripped open wounds that had only just begun to scar over after a year of agonizing uncertainty. Kevin's parents, Robert and Elaine Marshall, had spent those long months clinging to the hope that their son might still be alive somewhere. Even in the darkest moments, Elaine would sit by the window at night, imagining the sound of Kevin's footsteps on the porch, the knock on the process door that would mean the nightmare was finally over. That hope dissolved into despair when she was handed the official report. She described the moment later as a silence so heavy, it crushed me. For Kevin's younger sister Anna, the loss was equally devastating. Kevin had always been her protector, the one who helped her with schoolwork, who teased her just enough to make her laugh when she was upset. She admitted that she still caught herself setting aside his favorite coffee mug as though he might walk in and reach for it one morning. These small, painful reminders of his absence became part of the family's daily reality. The community, too, felt the shock deeply. In Oak Ridge, where Kevin had grown up, people gathered in candlelight vigils and posted his photograph in shop windows for months after his disappearance. Neighbors who had known him as a quiet, good-natured young man could not accept the brutality implied by his discovery. The thought that a human being, someone they had shared conversations and laughter with, could end up hidden in such a grim place sent waves of unease through the town. Yet what haunted the family most was not just the loss, but the uncertainty that lingered around it. Who had wanted to harm Kevin? Why had his body been discarded in such a horrifying way? These unanswered questions became a shadow that followed them, making grief feel like an open wound that would never truly heal. The lack of resolution left them trapped between mourning and fear, unable to move forward. Reporters often pressed Robert for statements, hoping for dramatic headlines, but his words were always quiet, almost whispered. "I just want to know why. Why, my son?" That simple plea echoed what the entire family felt. It wasn't justice they longed for most, it was understanding. Without it, the tragedy seemed senseless, an unending loop of torment. Years later, the Marshall family's home still carried traces of Kevin's presence. His hiking boots remained by the back door, his old jacket hanging in the hallway. Elaine once said she could never bring herself to pack those things away. To her, they weren't relics, but threads that kept him tied to the family. The case left a lasting scar not only on Kevin's loved ones, but also on the broader community, a reminder of how fragile life could be and how the unknown could shatter even the strongest families. To this day, the story of Kevin Marshall lingers in the air around Oak Ridge, whispered like a cautionary tale, an echo of a young man whose life was stolen, leaving behind only sorrow and haunting silence. The story of Kevin Marshall does not fade easily. Even years after the official files were closed and the headlines moved on, his name still drifts through the town of Oak Ridge like an echo that refuses to die. People pass the abandoned sawmill on the edge of the forest and lower their voices, as if afraid to stir the shadows that cling to its broken walls. For some, it has become a symbol of unanswered questions, of the cruelty that hides in plain sight, waiting to claim the unsuspecting. For Kevin's family, every day remains a delicate balance between remembering and surviving. His mother still lights a candle in the window each evening, not as a beacon of hope anymore, but as a quiet ritual of love, a flame that says her son's presence will never be erased. His father has grown quieter, his words fewer, but when he does speak of Kevin, it is always with the same sentence: "He deserved more than this." The haunting lies not only in the brutality of Kevin's end, but in the silence that surrounds it. Who placed him there? What drove someone to such a dark act? These questions remain unanswered, leaving an invisible weight pressing on the hearts of those left behind. It is the kind of silence that gnaws at you, reminding you that some mysteries never release their grip. And yet, within the sorrow, there is also a fragile thread of meaning. Kevin's story is not just about what was taken from him, but about the reminder it leaves for us who remain, that life is fleeting, that each goodbye might carry more weight than we realize, that kindness, love, and connection are the only things that can outlast even the most terrible shadows. If you are listening now, let Kevin Marshall's name be more than a headline or a mystery. Let it be a reminder to hold your loved ones close, to cherish the ordinary moments, to notice the sound of a voice, the warmth of a hug, the presence of someone who matters. Because once they are gone, all that remains is the echo, and echoes cannot answer back. The forest still whispers Kevin's name, and perhaps it always will. His story lingers as a warning, but also as a call to remember, to care, and to never take for granted the fragile gift of time we are given. If this story left you with chills, remember there are countless others like it, still waiting in the shadows. Subscribe to Last Seen and join us as we uncover the mysteries of those who vanished and were never found.